Before getting out of her car, 16-year-old high school junior Raina Ryson wrapped her boyfriend's navy blue Letterman jacket more tightly around her shoulders. Even if it hadn't been a chilly, cloudy day in the town of LaPorte, Indiana, Raina still would have worn the warm and oversized jacket, because this was 1993, and the fact that Matt Elser had given Raina this baseball-style jacket with his name embroidered across the shoulder was a public declaration that the two of them were, once again, a couple, just as they had been, on and off, ever since Raina had been in the 7th grade. And even more important to Raina, wearing Matt's Letterman jacket gave her a feeling that most of her peers took for granted, a sense that she was safe and protected. Now, stepping out of her tan 1984 LTD Ford sedan into the high school parking lot, Raina gave herself just a few seconds to really savor the excitement and happiness she had been feeling all week long about the date that she and Matt had planned for tonight, Friday, March 26th. Turning to grab her backpack out of the car before shutting the driver's side door, Raina just felt thankful that after their latest breakup, she and Matt had both felt so lonely for one another, so incomplete without each other, that getting back together again was a mutual decision. As Raina looked around the busy parking lot and waved to a few of her friends and fellow members of the high school marching band, she thought about how right she and Matt were for each other. Both of them made accomplishments like getting grades good enough to consistently have their names listed on the school's honor roll look easy. With all of its emblems, Matt's jacket alone represented many of his accomplishments, like being a member of the school's track and basketball teams. But it was the treble clef note stitched on the chest across the school logo that showed one of the passions they both shared, and that was music. Although not even Matt could compete with Raina and her ability to play not just first oboe in the school band, but also the flute and the clarinet. Not that Raina planned to pursue music once she graduated from high school. As she had told Matt, along with her family, Raina's real dream in life was to become a veterinarian, which is why her part-time job at the local animal clinic was far and away her favorite of the 3 part-time jobs that took up so much of Raina's after-school life. Usually, on a Friday evening, it would be that 4 to 6 p.m. shift at Pine Lake Animal Hospital that would be one of the high points of the start of the weekend. But today, Raina knew that while she fed the animals and cleaned cages that afternoon, what she'd really be thinking about was dinner later that evening with Matt. A moment later, as Raina walked into LaPorte High School and headed for her locker, she was immediately lost in the crowd of students who were all spinning their combination locks and exchanging greetings with each other before the first bell of the day called them all into class. With her thick mane of curly brown hair, her blue jeans and sneakers, her average height and her average weight, Raina looked like any other high school student from any other solid middle-class family in this typical Midwestern town of about 20,000 residents. But in Raina's class, looks were deceiving, because Raina was different from most of the other girls in that loud and busy hallway. Behind that smile and behind that talent for telling jokes that made her friends laugh out loud, Raina had recently survived a profound physical and emotional trauma. Beginning when she was just 11 years old, Raina had become the victim of a sexually abusive relationship. The perpetrator was her then 24-year-old brother-in-law, the husband of Raina's then 20-year-old sister, Lori, and the father of the couple's 2 small children, Raina's beloved niece and nephew. Raymond McCarty's abuse continued until Raina was 13 years old. That's when Raina became pregnant, and not even her abuser's threats that he would kill her if she told anyone about what he was doing to her could force her to keep this terrible secret. Raina finally broke down and told her mother and father what had been going on during those so-called family visits to her sister's home across town. Raina's father, Ben Ryson, had been the one to tell Raina's sister, Lori, what had happened. Confronted by Ben, Raymond McCarty admitted that he had been having sex with Raina and agreed to turn himself into police. And in 1991, 2 years earlier, Raymond was convicted of a Class D felony for child molesting. A felony is the legal definition for a serious crime. Punishment can range from 1 year in prison to death. Class D is the least serious felony, a category that includes cruelty to animals, defacing a firearm, and aggravated assault. And instead of being ordered to serve time in prison, Raymond was given 2 years probation. Raymond's wife, Lori, stayed with Raymond, and Raina's parents also maintained ties with Raymond. In order to keep Raina safe, the family decided they would set their own internal restrictions to keep Raymond away from Raina. Now, 3 years after this traumatic experience, Raina's boyfriend, Matt, was one of just a few people outside the Ricin family who knew the details of Raina's abuse. Along with Matt in this small circle, there was also Raina's earlier boyfriend, a boy named Jason Tibbs, who Raina had, quote, dated, end quote, for about 6 months when both she and Jason were in the 6th grade. Given how young both Raina and Jason were, Raina's parents were relieved when the youngsters broke up and went back to just being very good friends. They were also pleased when Raina eventually settled her affections on Matt, who was just the kind of clean-cut, studious, and straight-arrow teenager that they felt would treat Raina well. Still, Raina had felt very relieved to be able to confide in both her friends, Jason as well as Matt, about a recent and unwelcome development in her life. Just several weeks earlier, Raymond McCarty had finished his probation sentence, which meant that as far as the courts were concerned, he'd served his time for having sexually abused Raina, and now he was free. And now that Raymond was free of the restrictions that the courts had placed on his behavior, it was up to the Ricin family to monitor Raymond's relationship and behavior towards Raina. Given how emotionally loaded this topic was for Raina's sister Lori and for Raina's parents, it was easier for Raina to tell Jason and Matt, rather than her own family, that it seemed to her that since Raymond's release from probation, her brother-in-law was once again making unwanted advances towards Raina. Standing in front of her school locker, Raina again pulled Matt's jacket close around her and reminded herself that she was strong and that she was loved. Even when Matt had asked for that recent break in their relationship, Raina had not fallen apart. She had said yes, and she had kept herself busy with her job tutoring a couple of middle school students, working at a local takeout restaurant, and best of all, working at the Pine Lake Animal Hospital. Still, Raina had been incredibly happy when she and Matt had both decided to get back together again. Now, tucking her school books under her arm, Raina looked down at her watch. She was so excited about this evening's special dinner with Matt that she was literally counting down the hours. At 6 p.m. sharp that Friday night, Raina stepped out of the Pine Lake Animal Hospital. In exactly 1 hour, Matt was supposed to pick her up at her house on 202 A Street, just 1.5 miles south of the animal clinic. Raina had already made a quick trip to the Ricin's neat 2-story home in the shady neighborhood where Raina lived with her parents and her younger sister Wendy. She'd stopped there right after school, just long enough to grab a snack, change into her work jeans and sweatshirt, drop off her book bag, and say goodbye to her younger sister Wendy, who was headed out the door to go see a movie with some friends. Raina hadn't needed to tell her sister or parents how quickly she planned to get back to the house after her 4 to 6 p.m. shift that evening. Everyone already knew how much Raina and Matt were looking forward to their date that night, and how Raina would want to spend as much time as she could between 6 and 7 picking out what to wear and making sure she looked her best for when Matt arrived. But now, as Raina was getting ready to close up the animal clinic for the evening, she heard the door to the waiting room open, and right away, Raina's heart sank. Tightening her hands around the handle of the broom she was holding, Raina hoped it was not the same person who had paid her an unexpected visit earlier in the afternoon. Matt was too excited about the evening he had planned for Raina to wait until 7 p.m. Arriving early at the Ricin house at 202 A Street, he parked his car by the curb, looking up first at the lighted front porch, then down at his watch. But when 7 p.m. came and went, and Raina still had not opened her front door, Matt decided to drive to the Pine Lake Animal Hospital, thinking that maybe Raina had to work late that evening. But when Matt arrived at the square 1-story clinic 5 minutes later, there was no sign of Raina, and no sign of her tan Ford LTD car. After making the loop again, from the clinic to Raina's house, and then back to the clinic, Matt drove back to 202 A Street, parked his car at the curb, walked up to the Ricin's front door, and knocked. A moment later, Raina's dad, Ben, was telling Matt that Raina still had not arrived home from work. When Ben invited Matt to come inside and wait for Raina there, Matt explained that Raina was not at the animal clinic either. In that moment, both Matt and Ben Ricin knew something had to be wrong. For the past week, all Raina had talked about was this date with Matt. If she hadn't been delayed by a work emergency, there was just no way Raina would have stood Matt up. And there was also no way that Raina would just hop into her car and drive off without a word to Matt or to her family. By 10:30 p.m. that night, Ben and his wife Karen Ryson arrived at the LaPorte police station to report their 16-year-old daughter missing. After being informed that police would not start searching for Raina until she had been missing for 24 hours, the Rysons returned home, and frustrated by the response they had just gotten from police, the Rysons contacted the LaPorte High School music director, and together, the three adults launched their own search. 12 hours later, on the morning of Saturday, March 27th, the town was plastered with flyers and posters showing pictures of Raina and letting people know that she was last seen at the animal clinic the night before. Raina was still missing, but now there were so many people, her family, her friends, her fellow band members, her neighbors, out looking for her that local police realized they could not just stand on the sidelines. So, by mid-morning, well before that 24-hour mark had passed, police issued their own call for information and tips about the missing 16-year-old, and by Saturday afternoon, there were state police helicopters flying low over LaPorte County, and police from other nearby areas had also joined the search. Almost immediately, the public appeal for information resulted in what police and the family believed might be an important lead. More than one witness had stepped forward to say they had seen two cars in the parking lot at the animal clinic around 6 p.m. on Friday night. In addition to Raina's car, there was another sedan, this one with two men inside and a teenage girl standing outside the car who appeared to be arguing with the person in the passenger seat. These bystanders had chalked up the scene to a possible teenage lover's quarrel until they saw the flyers that featured a missing teenage girl who fit the description of the girl they'd observed in the parking lot. Raina's father, Ben, had already given police his account of Raina's disappearance and mentioned Matt's presence at the Ryson family home the night Ben first asked police for their help. But in light of this tip that suggested Raina's disappearance might be connected to an argument or even a kidnapping that could involve more than one suspect who might have had contact with Raina just before she went missing, investigators got busy with formal interviews of Raina's family and friends. Detectives were especially interested in talking to Raina's boyfriend, Matt, asking him to give a more detailed account of exactly what he had been doing and where he was the night that Raina disappeared. But Matt's story was the same one Ben and Matt had both told on the night of Friday, March 26th. He arrived at Raina's house before 7 p.m. for their date. When Raina didn't show up, he made a few trips out to the animal hospital where he saw no sign of Raina or her car before he entered the Ryson house at about 7:15 to wait there with Raina's parents and sister for Raina to come home. But even before police had a chance to confirm Matt's story and his alibi, there was yet another very big development in what had become an official missing persons investigation. On Sunday morning, March 28th, so about 30 hours after Raina's disappearance, police reported finding Raina's car parked alongside a county road about 9 miles from her home. The hood was propped open, like the driver had been having car troubles, but police quickly determined that the scene had only been staged to appear that way. Not only did police find Raina's purse and car keys left inside of the 1984 tan Ford sedan, but when police turned on the engine, the car worked just fine. Then, even as crime scene techs were called to the scene to look for fingerprints and other potential evidence to explain what had happened, police found a ring, too large to fit Raina, in the glove compartment of the car. 7 days after Raina's disappearance, inquiries among Raina's friends about who the ring might belong to led police to Raina's former boyfriend and childhood friend, Jason Tibbs, one of the many people who had participated in the ongoing search for Raina. Jason was surprised but not worried when police showed him the ring they had found. He identified it right away as his ring and explained that he must have stowed it inside of the glove compartment of Raina's car when he had taken it off so he could fit his hand inside of a tight space while repairing Raina's car radio a few months ago. Jason also shrugged off Matt's suggestion to police that Jason was still romantically interested in Raina. Jason readily admitted to investigators that yes, he and Raina had dated briefly back in middle school before Raina and Matt had become a couple. But since then, Jason and Raina had just been friends, an account that was later confirmed by Raina's father, Ben, who remembered that Raina had asked Jason if he could help her with some small car repairs. Like Matt, Jason also had an alibi for the Friday night that Raina went missing. He'd spent that evening playing a popular game of car hide-and-seek with his friends. Called fox hunting, the game involved a driver parking their car somewhere in town, and then, using citizen band radios called CBs, the driver would give out clues that would eventually lead a winner to find the car and driver. And sure enough, police confirmed that Jason had given clues on and off throughout that evening to his fellow players via the citizen band radio. It wasn't until several days later that police made the discovery that would change the direction of the investigation into Raina's disappearance. That's when police discovered the Letterman jacket belonging to Matt Elser, the jacket that Raina wore or took with her everywhere in a wooded area that police had already searched several times since Raina's disappearance. Hanging 3 feet above the ground in the branches of a tree, located in a wooded area 6 miles south of where Raina's car had been found, the sudden appearance of the jacket confirmed the growing suspicion that there was nothing voluntary about Raina's disappearance, and that someone had realized after Raina went missing that they had to get rid of a piece of important evidence that might link them to the missing teenager. Right away, police re-interviewed the owner of the jacket, Matt, but again, Matt's story was exactly the same, and everyone who knew Raina confirmed that whether Matt was with Raina or not, Raina was always wearing or carrying Matt's Letterman jacket with her. But it wouldn't be until 24 days later, on April 27, 1993, that the Ricin family received the phone call that they, and the rest of the close-knit town of LaPorte, had quietly been dreading. That was when a teenage daughter, whose dad was fishing at a county pond just 30 feet from a nearby road and 7 miles from the Pine Lake Animal Hospital, discovered the submerged and badly decomposed body of a white female wearing clothes and jewelry that matched the physical description of Raina Ricin. 1 day later, an autopsy by the county coroner would confirm Raina's identity. The 3.5-hour examination would also reveal that the cause of Raina's death was strangulation. And suddenly, what had been a missing persons investigation was now officially a homicide investigation. With the recovery of their 16-year-old daughter's body, along with the terrible knowledge that she had been murdered, the Ricin family went from praying for Raina's safe return to praying that her killer would be brought to justice. And for the first time since Friday, March 26th, the Ricin family turned off their front and back porch lights that they had left on for 33 days, hoping to welcome home their beloved middle daughter. 3 days later, on May 1st, hundreds of people would attend the funeral service for one of LaPorte High School's most gifted musicians, and Raina, 1 week shy of her 17th birthday, would be buried by her family in a white casket trimmed with pink and covered with a blanket of flowers. Meanwhile, information that had been reported in the newspaper just days after Raina's disappearance, back when she was still considered missing and not murdered, now took on new significance and pointed investigators towards a new suspect, Raina's brother-in-law, Raymond McCarty. Looking through old police reports, investigators had found the statement Raina had made back in 1991 that contained graphic details of the sexual abuse that Raina had suffered at the hands of her brother-in-law. And during yet another round of interviews with both Matt and Jason, both boys would tell police that since Raymond had completed his probationary sentence several weeks before Raina's disappearance, Raina had mentioned that Raymond, once again, seemed to be making sexual overtures. Now, with both Matt and Jason's alibis still holding up, investigators wondered if maybe Raymond might have killed Raina out of anger that she had reported the abuse that led to his conviction 2 years earlier, or that she had rejected and maybe threatened to go public with any new advances he may have made. Police suspicions were heightened when they discovered that Raina had had an argument with her sister, Lori, Raymond's wife, the week before Raina disappeared. And during that argument, Lori accused Raina of leading Raymond on. On April 30th, one day before Reina's funeral, and again on June 13th, police impounded both vehicles belonging to Raymond and Lori McCarty to search for any evidence that might link Reina's sister or brother-in-law to Reina's murder. Meanwhile, Raymond's account of where he was on the evening that Reina disappeared would keep changing. At the time of Reina's disappearance, Raymond told police he was out of the area at a friend's farm. But later, Raymond would tell police that he had given a female hitchhiker a ride that evening. Later still, Raymond would tell police that on the evening of Reina's disappearance, he was actually looking at a house for sale that was located just a few blocks from the Pine Lake Animal Hospital. 17 months later, police formally identified Lori and Raymond as suspects in Reina's homicide. But before detectives could put together a case against these two suspects, police received a shocking tip that looked like it would send the homicide investigation in a completely different direction. In December of 1994, about 3 months after Lori and Raymond were named as suspects, LaPorte law enforcement got a call from police in Illinois who had arrested a man on kidnapping charges. Larry Hall, who would later become a notorious suspected serial killer, claimed that he had raped and murdered several young women, including Reina Ryson. Inside the man's van, police found newspaper articles about Reina's disappearance and murder, along with a bottle of birth control pills that had a crudely printed label on it with Reina's name. But it wouldn't take long for Larry Hall to recant that confession, and in the meantime, police had determined that the label on the pill bottle was a fake and that the suspect could not have killed Reina because he had been in Kentucky at the time of Reina's disappearance. 3.5 years later, with no other active leads, police had once again circled back to Raymond McCarty as their primary suspect. And in May of 1998, just over 5 years after Reina's disappearance and murder, police arrested Raymond and charged him with Reina's murder and locked him up in LaPorte County Jail pending a trial. But 15 months later, prosecutors decided that the evidence they had collected against Raymond was not strong enough to support a charge of murder. That evidence, found inside Raymond's vehicle and inside the McCarty house, consisted of several handguns, a stun gun, and bloodstains in his car that later turned out to belong to a deer that Ray had shot while he was out hunting. So, in August of 1999, 6 years and 4 months after Reina was murdered, Raymond McCarty was released from jail, and the investigation into Reina's death hit what looked like its final dead end. Once every year, a $200 scholarship in Reina's memory was still awarded to a member of the LaPorte High School band. No one had ever claimed the $36,000 reward for information leading to the arrest and conviction of Reina's killer. And no one inside the community had come forward with any new revelation about what might have happened to Reina. And over the years, while the town of LaPorte never forgot that there might still be a killer in their midst, people's fear that the killer might strike again slowly faded into the distant past. It wasn't until the early summer of 2013, more than 20 years after Reina Ryson was murdered, that police finally got the break in this case that they had been looking for. That's when detectives were able to act on a tip they had actually gotten 5 years earlier and do a formal interview with an eyewitness to Reina's murder. In exchange for a promise that they would not face any criminal charges, this eyewitness walked investigators through everything that happened on the night of March 26th, when 16-year-old Reina stepped out of the Pine Lake Animal Clinic and saw an Oldsmobile Buick parked in the lot outside the clinic door. The story police heard would change every single thing they thought they knew about Reina's murder. Based on that eyewitness account, here is a reconstruction of what police believe happened on the night that Reina Ryson disappeared. As Reina's killer slipped into the front passenger seat of the Oldsmobile Buick, they looked down at their watch and gave a nod of satisfaction. It was a foggy Friday night in LaPorte, Indiana, and the killer intended to kick off the weekend with a little visit to the Pine Lake Animal Hospital. Turning to the driver, who had borrowed this car from a friend, the killer gestured to the road ahead. Time to get going. A few minutes later, the driver and the killer had arrived at their destination. The killer looked first at the clock on the dashboard and then around the animal clinic parking lot to make sure it was empty, except for Raina's tan LTD Ford. Then the killer smiled. Perfect. There was still plenty of time before the clinic closed for the killer to get inside. And from the empty lot, the killer assumed that no one other than Raina was inside. Opening the passenger side door, the killer got out of the car and told the driver to wait while the killer went into the one-story square building located at 330 Pine Lake Avenue. Inside the clinic, Raina was doing what she always did at the end of her shift, sweeping the floor and tidying up. But hearing the front door into the clinic open, Raina suddenly froze. She'd already had one unexpected visitor that afternoon, and she hoped that whoever had just walked in this close to closing time was just there for business. But as soon as Raina saw who this new visitor was, her shoulders relaxed. Letting out a breath that she hadn't even realized she'd been holding, Raina pushed her hair back from her face as she stopped to lean on the handle of the broom. But after just a short conversation with her visitor, Raina's sense of relief had been replaced by frustration and annoyance. Having this discussion was not how Raina had planned to spend even a minute of her evening. It was now 6 p.m. and time to close the clinic, and all Raina wanted to do was head home so she could get ready for her date with Matt. But when Raina and her visitor walked out the front door together a few minutes later, the two of them had already started to argue. And when Raina had turned around after locking the front door of the clinic, she saw that parked right there in front of her in the lot was a car, engine running, and a driver in the front seat. By the time Raina and her killer had reached the Oldsmobile Buick, it was clear to Raina that her visitor was not going to be satisfied until the two of them had finished this conversation once and for all. So when Raina's killer gestured toward the car and asked Raina to just get in so they could drive around and talk, Raina looked down at her watch. She had a few minutes to spare, and better to just get this conversation over with here and now. So Raina agreed to the plan, on the condition that it really would be a short drive, because she had a date at 7 p.m. that evening that she was not about to miss. Just a moment later, Raina, wearing the Letterman jacket that she would later take off inside the car, had slipped into the back seat with her visitor. As soon as the driver heard the back door of the car shut, they checked the side and rear view mirror, put the car into gear, and pulled away from the clinic, heading east on Pine Lake Avenue. By the time the car had turned onto a heavily wooded section of North Vale Road, about 4 miles from the animal clinic, one or both of the passengers demanded that the driver stop the car. The argument in the back seat had gotten so loud that the driver was alarmed and immediately pulled over and turned off the engine. Looking up at the rearview mirror, the driver saw both passengers jump out of the car, then come into view again as they faced off on the deserted road, standing just behind the car's rear bumper. Their fight now was physical, and Raina was using every ounce of strength to protect herself. But a second later, the driver saw Raina's killer pull back their arm and deliver a savage punch directly into Raina's face. Scrambling out of the front seat, the driver made it around the side of the car just in time to see that Raina lay on the ground and that her attacker had straddled her body and wrapped their hands around Raina's neck. As the driver stood there, frozen, Raina's attacker leaned hard into Raina's neck, cutting off her supply of oxygen and literally squeezing the life out of her. Afterward, there was a moment of stunned silence, and then, standing up slowly and still breathing hard, Raina's killer gestured for the driver to open the trunk of the car. Together, the killer and the driver lifted Raina's body up off the road and dumped her into the trunk. Slamming the lid of the trunk shut, the driver and killer got back into the car and headed for the barn located a few miles away that belonged to the family of the person who owned the Oldsmobile Buick. Once inside the big open space of the pole barn, neither the killer nor the driver looked up at the rafters and saw 14-year-old Ricky Hammonds, the brother of the car's owner, sitting up in the loft getting high on a joint of marijuana. But that 14-year-old boy saw them, and when the two people below him popped open the trunk of the car and stared down at the body of a teenage girl with brown curly hair, dressed in blue jeans and sneakers, Ricky saw that too. And later that weekend, when 14-year-old Ricky Hammonds heard about the missing girl from LaPorte High School and saw her picture in the papers and on the news, he knew that the name of the girl in the trunk of the family's Oldsmobile Buick was Raina Rison. But on that cool Friday evening, all Ricky knew was that he better stay really, really quiet, because people who drove around with a dead body in their car were dangerous. Ricky was relieved when the car's driver and passenger finally stopped arguing, hopped back in the Buick, turned on the engine, and then reversed out of the barn. But even after the sound of the car tires rolling across gravel had faded, Ricky stayed where he was, holding the smoke from the joint inside his lungs. If he told anyone about what he had seen, maybe those two people would come back and kill him too. Or maybe he'd get in trouble for smoking marijuana. Either way, the 14-year-old boy decided not to say anything at all. Breathing the smoke out through his nose, he tried to enjoy the last few puffs on his joint, but it wasn't any use. The buzz he'd been feeling before the car had rolled into the pole barn was as dead as the girl with the white face, all the color drained right out of her. Meanwhile, the Buick's driver had dropped Raina's killer back off at the Pine Lake Animal Hospital to pick up Raina's tan Ford sedan. Holding Raina's purse and car keys, the killer hopped behind the wheel of Raina's car, started up the engine, and then, one behind the other, the cars headed in the direction of a small county pond about 7 miles away. Once they were close enough to their destination that they could see the water about 30 feet from the road, the cars pulled to a stop. A few minutes later, the driver of the Buick, along with Raina's killer, had dragged Raina's body out of the trunk. After dumping Raina face down in the weeds and muck at the edge of the pond, the driver and killer grabbed 2 nearby logs and pulled them on top of Raina's body until she was fully submerged. The driver and killer wiped off their hands and got back into their cars. A few minutes later, they came to a stop along County Road 200E, 5 miles northwest of LaPorte. After parking Raina's car on the shoulder of the road, Raina's killer propped open the hood so the car looked disabled and abandoned. Then, hopping back into the passenger seat of the Oldsmobile Buick, the killer rolled the car window partway down, leaned back, and sucked in big mouthfuls of the chill night air. Pulling away from the side of the road, the driver turned the car south. A few minutes later, the driver of the car dropped the killer off at the killer's house and then returned the car he had been driving that night to the pole barn. Even if the driver of the car had known to look, by then, 14-year-old Ricky Hammonds was nowhere in sight. Later that same night, the killer would return to the pole barn to pick up the Letterman jacket that Raina had left in the back seat of the Buick. And a day or two later, and Raina's killer would drive to the same secluded area where the killer had strangled Raina, and the killer would throw the jacket as far as they could into the woods, hoping that if the jacket was ever found, it would lead police to Raina's boyfriend, Matt Elser. 15 years later, in 2008, Ricky Hammonds decided it was time to tell police what he saw in the pole barn the night that Raina Rison was murdered, and give the police the names of the 2 people he believed killed her. By then, Ricky's own life had gone off the rails, and the now 29-year-old Ricky was serving a 44-year-long prison sentence for a murder that he had committed 10 years earlier. But Ricky wasn't looking for any personal benefit in exchange for talking with state police. According to Ricky, now that he had nieces of his own, he just wanted the Rison family to know what happened to their 16-year-old daughter. But even though Ricky's account of what he saw that night in the barn seemed very credible, it would take another 5 years before Indiana state prosecutors would offer immunity to the driver of the Oldsmobile Buick in exchange for testifying against Raina's killer. That driver was a man named Eric Freeman, who, at the time of Raina's death, was the boyfriend of the car's owner, Ricky's older sister. And in June of 2013, after more than 20 years of chasing hundreds of dead ends, investigators sat down with Eric Freeman and finally confirmed the identity of Raina's killer, her one-time boyfriend in middle school and one of the few people Raina had entrusted with her secrets and her friendship, Jason Tibbs, who was 16 years old at the time of her murder. It would turn out, starting back in the 6th grade, Jason had developed such strong feelings for Raina that even after their 6-month preteen romance ended, Jason had never given up on, quote, getting Raina back, end quote. Instead, in the years after their breakup, Jason had always kept in touch with Raina. He sent her love letters that police and Raina's family had found among Raina's belongings. Jason helped Raina with small car repairs, and Jason was outraged by the abuse that Raina had suffered at the hands of her brother-in-law, Raymond. and according to Jason's friend, Eric Freeman, on March 26, 1993, Jason had asked Eric to drive him to Pine Lake Animal Hospital, where Raina worked, so when Raina got off her shift at 6 p.m., Jason could talk with her again about the two of them maybe getting back together. But even before Raina agreed to get into the car with Jason and Eric told investigators that it was clear from Raina and Jason's argument that Raina, quote, just didn't want to be with Jason Tibbs, end quote. Freeman told police that during that drive, the couple's argument got so loud that Eric told them he wanted to leave, and Eric felt relieved when they told him to stop, and then both Raina and Jason got out of the car, but Eric said he never suspected that Jason was about to kill Raina. Afterward, when Eric and Jason arrived at the pole barn that belonged to the family of Eric's girlfriend, neither teenager noticed 14-year-old Ricky Hammonds up in the rafters smoking a joint. But when Eric stood next to Jason, looking down at Raina's body in the open trunk of the Buick, and asked Jason why he'd killed her, both Eric and Ricky heard and remembered Jason's answer. Quote, "If I can't have her, nobody can," end quote. As for Jason's alibi, that he was out fox hunting in his car with friends, police would discover that while players may have heard Jason's voice on their CB radios that night, no one actually saw him and could confirm his physical whereabouts. As for Raina's earlier visitor at the animal hospital on the afternoon of March 26th, that was her brother-in-law, Raymond McCarty. It was Raymond's sexual abuse of Raina, coupled with his eventual admission that on the afternoon Raina had disappeared, he had gone from looking at that house for sale directly to the animal clinic to visit Raina, that would make Raymond the prime suspect in Raina's murder and help lead to his wrongful arrest back in 1998. On August 23, 2013, 20 years and 5 months after Raina Ricin was strangled to death, 37-year-old Jason Tibbs, who was married with children and still living in LaPorte County, Indiana, was arrested and charged with Raina Ricin's murder. On November 7, 2014, Jason was found guilty. 1 month later, Jason Tibbs was sentenced to the state minimum for a murder committed in 1993, 40 years in prison, but with 20 years of that sentence already served. Raina's brother-in-law, Raymond McCarty, would die in February 2018 at the age of 52 from a self-inflicted wound. At the time of his death, Raymond McCarty was in jail, having been arrested 3 days earlier on a charge of battery resulting in serious bodily injury. The inscription on Raina Ricin's headstone reads, quote, "She now plays a flute of silver and an oboe of gold," end quote. On July 18, 2019, 28-year-old Andrew Harper scrawled a little note inside of a card, and then he folded the card up, he slipped it into its envelope, and he handed that envelope off to a nearby friend. And this friend, after getting this envelope and Andrew's directions for what to do with it, he left Andrew's room and began walking down the hall all the way towards the other side of the Ardington house. The Ardington house, where they were staying, is this beautiful mansion built in the 1700s that sits on about 30 acres of gardens and parklands, and it's located about an hour west of London in the English countryside. Once Andrew's friend, with this letter in hand, had walked all the way across the mansion and had found the room he was looking for, he gently knocked on the door, and then after being let inside, he made his way right over to 28-year-old Lissy Beckett, and he handed her the envelope. Lissy and Andrew had grown up in the same town of Wallingford, which is a small rural town about 10 miles away from where they were at the Ardington house. And from the time Lissy and Andrew had met each other when they were 15 years old, they had become totally inseparable. It was truly love at first sight. And now, 13 years later, they were finally getting married. And so Lissy, after getting this envelope, she saw the writing on the outside of it and knew it was from her fiancé. And so she smiled, she opens up this letter, and she reads what's inside. And it just said, "Life is slippery. Here, take my hand." While on the surface, this little note seemed like nothing more than a romantic gesture from Andrew, in reality, those 7 words contained in that card were a great representation of who Andrew really was. He was a protector. Ever since Lissy could remember, Andrew had always been so concerned with her safety. And for that matter, anybody around Andrew was just worried about and wanted to make sure everybody was taken care of. And as Andrew got older and grew to be this massive 6'5" tall man, his natural inclination to protect other people only became more pronounced. While Andrew was known for being incredibly charming and friendly and approachable, at a moment's notice, he could flip the switch and literally step in and use his big frame to protect anybody that needed protecting, no questions asked. And so it came as no shock to Lissy or really anybody who knew Andrew when Andrew, at the age of 19, became a special constable or volunteer police officer for the Thames Valley Police Department. This police department was the same one that oversaw Wallingford, where he and Lissy had grown up, and also the surrounding areas. And just a year after becoming a special constable, Andrew had done such an amazing job that he was hired on by the Thames Valley Police Department to be a regular constable, so a full-fledged police officer. And over the following years that he was a regular constable, Andrew's hard work and dedication would quickly make him one of the most well-respected and well-liked police officers on the force. In fact, just a few weeks before he sent off that letter to Lissy on the day of their wedding, Andrew had been promoted. He had been assigned to the road policing unit within the Thames Valley Police Department, and what that meant was, in addition to a host of new responsibilities on a day-to-day basis, Andrew would now become one of the police officers who would immediately respond to any emergency call that came in. He was basically a front lines police officer now. And so, of course, this meant Andrew's job just became a lot more dangerous, but for Andrew, that didn't matter at all, because to him, the most important thing was protecting people in need. And so this promotion just gave him a bigger opportunity to do that. And so Lissy, after reading this little note that Andrew had just sent her, she set it down on the table, and now with a big grin on her face, she finished getting ready, and then that afternoon, she and Andrew would walk down the aisle, and they would say, "I do," in front of their families and their closest friends, and then that evening, after the newlyweds had had their first dance as a married couple, they would tell each other that this was the happiest day of their lives. 28 days later, on August 15th, Andrew, along with his partner, who also was named Andrew, his name was Andrew Shaw, they were conducting a surveillance operation in a town called Reading. Reading is a town about 30 minutes south of Wallingford. Just after 11 p.m., the men finally decided it was time to shut down their operation and head back home. Their shift had actually ended 4 hours earlier, but being hardworking and diligent police officers, they had worked overtime because they knew it would help their unit. But now at 11 p.m., they were totally exhausted, and so as they're kind of yawning and packing up their things, Shaw, who was driving, would fire up the engine of the unmarked BMW car they were in, and then once it was on, he would pull away from the curb, and they would start heading north. At the same time, a very distressed man who lived not far from where Andrew and Shaw had just been doing surveillance, he called 999 and he told the dispatcher that just a few moments ago, this gray sedan had pulled up his driveway and stopped right outside of his property. Now, this man's property was off of a road called Admore Lane, which was this winding one-lane country road that had very little traffic, and there was not that many properties off of it. And so for anybody to pull on to this man's property would have caught his attention, let alone a car pulling onto his property in the middle of the night. And so as soon as the man had seen these headlights coming up his driveway, he had gone to the window and watched, wondering, what is this person doing? Had they turned onto the wrong property? Are they going to turn around and leave? But to his horror, once this car had stopped right outside of his house, 3 masked men who were carrying weapons of some kind got out of the vehicle. And so at that point, the man had frantically dialed 999, and as he's trying to describe the situation to the dispatcher, he suddenly tells the dispatcher as he's looking out the window that he thinks these men are here to steal his quad bike. His quad bike was parked right outside of his detached garage, and he saw them walking towards it. And so he tells the dispatcher, who's already told him that police are on the way, he tells the dispatcher, "I can't wait any longer. I'm going out to confront them and stop them from stealing my bike." The dispatcher yells at him not to and says, "They have weapons, stay in your house," but this guy's not listening, and so he runs to his front door, he opens the front door up, but by the time he's looking outside, the gray car, the 3 masked men, they're all gone, and so too is his quad bike. And so he goes back in the house, he's talking to the dispatcher, and the dispatcher says, "Look, just stay at your house, the police are on the way, they will intercept that car, they'll get your quad bike back." And so seconds later, a call went out over the radio to Thames Valley Police to go and intercept this gray car on Admore Lane. So whoever was closest, go over there, but be advised, the occupants of this car are 3 masked men that are armed and dangerous. Now, Andrew and Shaw, when they heard this call, they would have known that they were not the only officers that could have taken this call. And they also would have known that they've been off the clock now for like 4.5 hours. There was no expectation that they would continue to work and go take this call. But they didn't care at all. When that call came across, the only thing they thought about was, do your job. And so Shaw, he whips the car around and he speeds towards Admore Lane and he pulls off of the main road called the A4. He gets onto Admore Lane and he starts driving north. Now, as soon as they turned onto that road, their vehicle effectively blocked the way for anybody coming the other direction. And so at this point, they're expecting this gray car full of these masked men to be coming in their direction, and they are now blocking the way. And so Andrew and Shaw, as soon as they get on that road, they know a close quarters confrontation is almost guaranteed. But when you listen to the dashcam footage from the front of their vehicle that picked up the voices of Andrew and Shaw as they turn onto this road, there is no nerves, there's no fear, there's no hesitation. They are calm as can be. This is what they have trained for. They were ready. And so Shaw, he's making his way up this winding road. It's totally pitch black. The trees are practically on top of the road. It's like a tunnel of trees. And so they're driving along this road, and then all of a sudden, up in the distance, you can see on the dash cam footage, you see headlights bombing toward them. They're way off in the distance, and then all of a sudden, that car, these headlights, they come flooring out right in front of them, and both cars come to a screeching stop. You can hear the screeching of the brakes on the dash cam footage. And so this car in front of them comes to a full stop, and Shaw, he stops, but then he moves up just a little bit closer before fully stopping the car. And so now the two cars are only maybe 10 or 15 feet apart. At this point, it's important to understand that the vehicle that Shaw and Andrew were in was an unmarked car, and they had intentionally not put on their blue lights as they're cruising up this road because they didn't want the suspects to see the blue lights in the distance and turn around and get away. And so now they've come face to face, and so Andrew and Shaw, they're looking at this vehicle, and they can see that one, it's a gray sedan, so it matches the description of the car they're looking for, and two, behind this gray sedan is what looks like a quad bike that they are towing. And so they know this is the car they were looking for. It's on Admore Lane. This is gonna be it. And so Shaw, he flips on the blue lights, and Andrew, who's in the passenger seat, he opens the door and begins yelling at the occupants to stay where they are. But they don't listen. Because now, the masked men in the gray car, they know they've been caught. There's police right in front of them. And so suddenly, one of the masked men in the back seat of this car, he leaps out of the vehicle and he runs around to the back of the gray car and he unhooks the quad bike. And then the gray car, without even waiting for this third masked man to get back inside, it just begins driving forward on the left side of Shaw and Andrew, basically trying to drive around them, despite the fact there's nowhere to drive. It's a ditch on either side of the road. But obviously, these guys are desperate and willing to do anything to get away. And so this gray car has driven down into this ditch before Andrew and Shaw could do anything. And then the third masked man, who's realizing he's being left behind, he starts running around the right side of the police car. So he's trying to go around the other way. And amazingly, as soon as the third masked man made it around to the back of the police car, the gray car somehow managed to pop out of the ditch and got back onto the road, and it starts driving away from Shaw and Andrew. And as they're driving away, the third masked man is just on the road running after them. And so Andrew, seeing an opportunity to potentially grab this third masked man that was out on foot, he jumps out of the police car, he turns, and starts running down the road after the suspects. And so Shaw, he doesn't have enough space on this road to turn around and drive after them, and so all he could do was put the car into reverse and then look over his shoulder and start driving in reverse after them. And so as Shaw is driving backwards down this road, he can see out of his rear window Andrew, who is chasing the third masked man, who is chasing the gray car. And so we can see all this happening out his back window. And then something totally strange that just defied logic happened. The third masked man suddenly leaps as if he's trying to jump into the moving car. And at the same time, Andrew, who's closed the distance on him, kind of lunges for the third masked man. And then just as suddenly as these two maneuvers have happened, both men just vanish, and then the gray car just drives away and disappears. And so Shaw, he's watching this happening, and he has no idea what he's just witnessed. He's thinking, where did Andrew go? Where'd the third masked man go? What's happened? But he still can only drive in reverse, and so he's just driving, and then finally he reaches a point in the road that's just wide enough that he's able to turn the car around, and as he's doing that, you hear over dispatch that someone is asking Shaw, what's going on? Where are you? And all Shaw is able to say is, my partner, Andrew, has gotten out of the vehicle, and I lost him. I don't know where he is. And so after Shaw has turned the vehicle around, he begins driving, now facing the proper direction. And as he's driving down this creepy dark road, you don't see anything. It's eerily quiet. Andrew's nowhere to be found. The car is nowhere to be found. The third masked man, there's no one. And so Shaw is just driving down the road, hoping that as he makes one turn or the next, he's gonna see his partner just kind of running on the road somewhere, but he doesn't. But as he's driving along, what Shaw didn't realize was that there were things in the road that belonged to Andrew. They were kind of small, so he didn't see them, but the footage would later reveal that it was almost like there was this trail of Andrew's things kind of littered all over the road. There was his wallet, then there was his badge, then there was his license and other ID cards, and then there was his glove, and then there was this piece of plastic that looked like it belonged on Andrew's vest. And then a little farther down the road, because Shaw is still driving and scanning for his partner and scanning for anything, and there's just nothing. As he's driving along, he would, in real time, notice something of Andrew's, and it was Andrew's stab vest that he wore over his chest. And so he stops the vehicle and he gets out, and again, he's on this totally pitch black road where it's weirdly quiet, and he's walking up and he grabs the vest, he comes back into his vehicle and he puts it down inside of his car. And at this point, over the radio, people are asking Shaw, what's going on? Where are you? And you hear in Shaw's voice a bit of panic as he's like, I've found Andrew's stab vest. It was on the side of the road, and he can't make sense of that. He has no idea why it's there. And dispatch, they don't know what to make of that. And so Shaw just continued driving down this road, thinking to himself, what's happening here? Meanwhile, less than a mile away at the end of Admore Lane, where it joined up with A4, which is where Andrew and Shaw had originally come in, two other Thames Valley police cars had arrived at that intersection. They had gone there specifically to try to intercept this gray car as they fled. And so they're sitting at this intersection and they're looking up Admore Lane and they see headlights bombing towards them. It's the gray car, and the gray car comes speeding out onto A4. It makes a hard turn and it speeds away from these two police cars. And so one of these two police cars that were waiting out on the A4, one of them takes off following the gray car. But the other police car, they stay right there, because unbelievably, they had just spotted Andrew. It would turn out when Shaw first put the BMW into reverse and he began going in reverse towards his partner who was chasing the third masked man who was chasing the gray car, when he was doing that and he was watching out his back window and he saw the third masked man jump and then disappear and then Andrew disappeared, that was not a figment of his imagination. That really happened. The third masked man had attempted to jump into the moving vehicle, and he had been successful. As for Andrew, why he suddenly vanished, the reason for that is truly horrific. The three masked men were 18-year-old Henry Long and 17-year-olds Albert Bowers and Jesse Cole. All three of them, prior to this night, had fairly extensive criminal records, and they proudly referred to themselves as career thieves, which basically just meant they spent all day and all night stealing from people. And so that night, they had gone out with the intention of stealing that man's quad bike. It's unclear how they knew he had a quad bike, but they definitely showed up prepared because they knew they would have to get onto his property and very quickly tow that bike out of there before the homeowner could stop them. And so they had attached this long, very thick rope to the back of their gray car. It was basically like this big loop of rope, almost like a lasso. And so when they pulled up onto that man's property, they backed up to the quad bike and they looped that stretch of rope over the handlebars of this quad bike. And then all three of them piled back into the gray car and they sped off with the quad bike in tow. But when they were on Admore Lane and came face to face with Andrew and Shaw and realized those are police officers and were caught, the third masked man, aka Jesse Cole, he hopped out of the gray car, he ran around to the back, and he unhooked the loop of rope from this quad bike, ditching the quad bike by the side of the road so that it would be easier for the gray car to make their getaway. And so once it was free, the gray car kind of took off without Jesse. And so Jesse ran around the cop car, but Jesse would get back up to the side of the gray car and he would leap into the window. And as soon as he was inside and Henry, who was driving, he knew he was inside, so they're all good. Henry hit the gas. And who was standing with both feet inside of that loop of rope dangling off the back of the gray car when the gray car suddenly accelerated? Andrew Harper. Andrew was swept off of his feet as the rope grabbed onto his legs, and so his head came back and smashed into the ground, and then he was dragged for 91 seconds at an average speed of 42.5 miles per hour down Admore Lane. It was only after he had been dragged for over a mile, whipping violently side to side, smashing not only into the ground, but into trees and fence posts and shrubs, just getting destroyed on this road, that finally, when they pulled off of Admore Lane and got onto A4, that turn swung Andrew around and he smashed into a curb that dislodged him from the rope and sent him careening into traffic. At that point, one of those two police cars took off after the gray car in pursuit. But the other car, they saw Andrew as he was thrown off the back of the gray car and launched onto A4. Now, initially, they actually thought that the suspects were just hauling a dead deer behind them because it looked like a bloody deer carcass was dangling behind the car. But when they ran up to see what it was, they saw it was their colleague. It was Andrew. And so immediately they tried to save his life, but Andrew's injuries were catastrophic. He had been destroyed. And so Andrew Harper would die at 11:45 p.m. on the side of the A4, about 20 minutes after he and his partner had so selflessly agreed to go after this car despite the fact they didn't have to. The three killers were arrested about 1 hour after Andrew had died. A police helicopter had spotted their car parked amongst some buildings about 4 miles away from where Andrew was found. During their trial, the three teens would say they had no idea that Andrew was attached to that tow rope as they sped down Admore Lane. This is despite the fact that the prosecution, they went out and recreated the exact scene that played out on Admore Lane. They used the same car, they used the same tow rope, and they used a very lifelike dummy that was the same size as Andrew Harper. It was 6'5", 200 pounds, and they strapped it on the back of the car, and they drove the same mile stretch to see what it would be like to drive with Andrew attached to the back. And these experts that went through this recreation over and over and over again, they said the same thing. It was nearly impossible to drive the car because as soon as the dummy would start to shift one way or the other, it would tug and pull on this little gray car. And so handling this car would have been a nightmare, not to mention the fact that the sound of Andrew grinding against the cement and smashing into trees and posts would have been extremely loud. And so the prosecution attested that there was absolutely no way that those three teens wouldn't have known that there was a person connected to the back of their car. Also, the prosecution said that all along Admore Lane, they found blood on both sides of the road, high up into bushes and on trees, indicating that as Henry had driven along with Andrew behind him, he must have been swerving violently side to side, most likely, at least according to the prosecution, to try to dislodge the person that was stuck on the back of his car. But the three teens never changed their story. They also never once said they regretted what they did. They showed absolutely no remorse. And when the verdict was read, and these three teens were not found guilty of murder, they were found guilty of manslaughter, but everybody knew that was significantly better because the sentences were so much shorter. When that verdict came back, These three teens were punching the air and cheering and laughing, just making a complete spectacle out of it. And then after being led out of the courthouse with the devastated family of Andrew Harper basically watching them, they were smirking and smiling at the cameras and waving and just treating the whole thing like it was one big joke. Still to this day, none of them have apologized or expressed any regret or remorse about what happened. In fact, two of the killers, Jesse and Albert, they've come out publicly and said they're going to write a book about this crime, about killing Andrew Harper, and there's no indication that this book is being written because they feel bad. It's almost certainly being written because it's an opportunity to make money. Following the verdict, Andrew's wife, Lissy, who was totally devastated not only by the loss of her husband, but also by what she viewed as total injustice with regards to the fact that these three killers had not been convicted of murder, she would go on to lobby for years to pass a brand new law called Harper's Law that would give an automatic life sentence to any criminal that killed an emergency worker while they were committing a crime. Meaning this law would not differentiate between whether it was manslaughter or murder. If you killed an emergency worker while committing a crime, you're going to jail for life. And this year, Harper's Law was passed. However, it will have no effect on the sentences of Andrew Harper's killers. Henry would be sentenced to 16 years in prison, and the other two, Albert and Jesse, would be sentenced to 13 years in prison each. All three of them will be eligible for parole by the time they are 28 years old, which is the same age that Andrew was when they killed him.
On the morning of August 30th, 2001, a middle-aged police sergeant named Alan McGregor drove with his partner, Officer Mark David, towards the Huron National Forest, which is a massive nature preserve in northern Michigan. The two of them were on the way to this forest to meet with a very unlikely detective, who McGregor believed might actually be the key to solving a case that had haunted him for the last 21 years. And that case was the disappearance of Cherita Thomas. Back in 1980, Cherita Thomas had been walking down the road, located about 1 mile away from the police station where Sergeant McGregor worked, when she had gotten into the car with this older man who had come by to pick her up. And after getting in this car, she was never seen again. Based on various tips and clues, police were nearly certain that that older man who had picked Cherita up was a guy named Jimmy Nelson. And their theory was he had murdered Cherita shortly after picking her up, and then afterwards disposed of her body in a particular section of the Huron National Forest. But the problem was, the police did not have any actual evidence that supported this theory. Their case against Jimmy was entirely circumstantial. In fact, they didn't even know if Cherita had really been murdered, because for the last 20 plus years, they had searched that particular section of the Huron National Forest, they'd gotten the FBI involved, they had chased down every lead, yet still, they had not found Cherita's body. So they really didn't know what happened. But as Sergeant McGregor neared the forest, he hoped that today would be the day that all changed. He pulled up by the entrance of the Huron National Forest, and he and his partner got their first look at their unlikely detective they were here to meet. And this detective was a Doberman Pinscher mix with big floppy ears who was lying on the ground and panting and wagging his tail. His name was Eagle, and he didn't look like a stereotypical police dog, because he wasn't a police dog. However, Eagle was the best crime scene sniffing dog in the entire world. His trainer, a 40-year-old woman named Sandra Anderson, was standing right beside him. Now, Sandra and Eagle were very famous in law enforcement circles, and so Sergeant McGregor and his partner were already well aware of their backstory. Sandra had actually adopted Eagle from a pound shortly before he likely would have been euthanized. And then after she adopted him, Sandra, who had made a career in teaching dogs how to sniff for cadavers, just sort of naturally on her off time, began training Eagle how to do it too. And amazingly, Eagle really took to it, better than police dogs did. Now, any good police cadaver dog could sniff out hidden objects and track a scent for miles, and Eagle could definitely do that. But also, Eagle could do things that the police cadaver dogs simply could not. Like he could smell blood that had been cleaned with bleach and also painted over. I mean, that's like a superpower. No dog could do that, but Eagle could. One forensic anthropologist who had come in contact with Eagle and seen what he could do firsthand said that, if a great cadaver dog was rated a 10 out of 10, well, Eagle was like a 20 out of 10. He was far and away the best of the best. And so Sergeant McGregor believed that if Cherita's body really was in that section of the Huron National Forest, well, Eagle would be able to find it. Sergeant McGregor was excited to see Eagle in action. But after he and his partner parked, they walked over and spent a minute, petting Eagle because Sandra said it was fine, and they gave him some pets, and Eagle really liked it, and he sort of rubbed up against them. But then at some point, Eagle just kind of stopped and looked towards the entrance of the National Forest, like he was ready to go. At which point Sandra said, okay, he's ready to work. So Sergeant McGregor and his partner followed behind Sandra and Eagle as they led the way into the forest towards the section where they had been told to search. And then once they reached that section, McGregor and his partner kind of stayed back on the fringes and just watched Eagle work. And it was incredible. Now, McGregor and his partner had seen police dogs work before, so they were familiar with basically the pace at which these dogs would find something, which often, it would take some time. But basically, as soon as they got to this clearing, they're watching Eagle and he's sort of walking around, sniffing, looking for something. But then suddenly he stopped, turned, and made a beeline towards this tree. And when he got there, he began pawing at the ground like he had found something. Sandra, his trainer, kneeled down next to him to see what Eagle had found, and she saw as he continued to dig that there was something in the ground. And so she called out to McGregor and his partner, and they came rushing over, and sure enough, Eagle had found a human bone fragment. To be clear, this dog only finds human bones, and so it's not like it would be able to find a chicken bone and think it was a human bone. Basically, if it found a bone, it's a human bone. McGregor and his partner were totally shocked here. I mean, they had really high hopes for the search, but to already be finding human remains in this particular section of the forest was revelatory. I mean, not only was it a big deal to find human remains here, but these could be Chiritas. This could be the key to unlocking this 2 decades old case. But Sandra, Eagle's trainer, did not seem shocked at all. This was pretty much par for the course. She smiled at the 2 investigators and kind of shrugged like, yep, this is what he does. She gave him a treat, and then Eagle got up and just continued searching the area. After Sandra and Eagle had taken off, McGregor and his partner bagged the bone fragment and then just kind of continued to let Eagle do his work. And over the course of that day, Eagle just kept on finding more human bones. It was truly incredible. And then the next day, when they came back for a second search, Eagle found even more. It was like there were human bones all over the place. However, this was actually kind of typical for human remains that have been left out in the wild for a long time, like they believed Chiritas had been. The idea is, after the body is left there and decomposes, animals come along and break apart the bones and kind of carry them in different directions. There's weather, there's a bunch of things that affect the body that sort of gradually takes it and spreads it all over the place. But as alarming as it was to find this many human bone fragments in such a small area in this forest, at the end of that second search on the second day, McGregor, all he could feel was elation. He felt like Eagle had done the exact thing he was hoping he would do. He had found the remains that very likely were Chirita Thomas's. McGregor thanked Sandra and Eagle profusely for their help, and then after saying bye to them, he and his partner went back to the station and they sent off the bone fragments to the FBI to be analyzed. And then after sending them off, they waited. The analysis would take several months, but in February of 2002, the FBI finally called McGregor. Now at this point, McGregor was very hopeful and sort of expected that these bone fragments would belong to Chirita, but what they actually said shocked him, because according to the FBI, those bone fragments that Eagle had dug up did not belong to Chirita. In fact, the bone fragments didn't even belong to a single person. They belonged to 3 different people. And when McGregor heard this, his blood ran cold, because he wasn't thinking, oh boy, this totally blows up the case. Instead, he's thinking, I bet Chirita is out in that forest. We just haven't found her yet, and if we keep using Eagle, we will find her. But now I have at least 3 more people that have been found out there, 3 dead people. So maybe Jimmy is way worse than I thought he was. Maybe he didn't just kill Chirita, maybe he's a serial killer and he's dumping his bodies in that part of the forest. However, as explosive as this new information was, it only made things way more complicated for McGregor, because he and his partner and all of his colleagues had no idea who these 3 new bodies were. And neither did the FBI. The FBI could only determine that these bone fragments came from 3 different people, but who they were, they didn't know. And so, to try to figure out who these 3 people were, Sergeant McGregor would need to find more clues. And to find more clues, he needed Eagle to go back to the forest and keep on looking. And so he immediately reached out to Sandra, who said that she and Eagle would come back out there and search the forest again. The new search began on April 17, 2002. McGregor, his partner, Sandra, Eagle, and a whole bunch of police officers and crime lab technicians descended once again on that same section of the Huron National Forest. But after a kind of lengthy search that day, the police officers, the entire police force that showed up, they didn't find anything of note. But Eagle, he did. At some point, Eagle had sniffed out a human knuckle bone in a dried out stream bed. When this discovery was made, Officer McGregor was elated because it was like, once again, we are finding evidence that's going to help him break this case he has been trying to crack for 20 years, which now might actually be way bigger than he thought it was. It might not just be the murder of Cherita. This might be the hunting grounds or the dumping grounds of a serial killer who killed Cherita Thomas. And he, McGregor, was going to be the one who solved it. He just knew it. But when McGregor turned back around to continue searching in the area that he was looking, he suddenly heard this commotion coming from behind him, sort of in the same direction where that human knuckle bone had been found. And he turns around and he sees what looks to be some sort of physical altercation happening amongst two people. He can't really tell who it is, but there's screaming happening. It's total chaos. And so, having no idea what was going on, McGregor abandoned his search, turned, and ran to go break it up. And after this fight was broken up, another major discovery was made. But it was not another bone. It would turn out the person who was dumping bodies in this section of the Huron National Forest was not a serial killer, nor was it Jimmy Nelson. Instead, the real culprit was actually one of the investigators who was out here doing this search right now. Eagle was not the world's greatest cadaver-sniffing dog. In fact, Eagle was not even a cadaver-sniffing dog at all. And his trainer, Sandra, was well aware of that, because this was all a big act. It would turn out, when Sandra and her dog were called out to a site to perform a search, Sandra would show up with a stash of human bones tucked into her clothing, right up against her skin. And then once the search began, she would discreetly pull little bone fragments out and drop them on the ground in front of Eagle, who would immediately notice them and alert people to them, making it seem like Sandra and her dog had once again saved the day. Sandra did this dozens of times across dozens of searches all over the country, all because she loved the thrill of watching the police discover her crimes in real time. Sandra had been successfully searching for body parts that she herself had planted for years without anybody being remotely suspicious of her. However, during the search for Cherita Thomas, Sandra got caught. Right before that fight broke out on that last search, Sandra and her dog had stepped off to the side and believed nobody was watching them, and Sandra bent down and pulled a bone fragment out of her sock and was about to place it, but then realized a crime lab technician was clearly watching her. She had been caught. And so the crime lab technician went up to Sandra to call her out on it, and Sandra, who knew she was caught, began to panic and pretended that she was being attacked by the crime lab technician and made a whole scene about it. That's what McGregor heard when he turned around and wondered if there was a fight going on. There was no fight. It was just Sandra, again, being caught red-handed. But as awful as Sandra's actions sound, she didn't actually kill anyone. Instead, during her years-long run of fraudulent searching, she had been stealing pieces of medical center cadavers and using those. Sandra ultimately pleaded guilty to multiple felonies, including falsifying evidence and obstruction of justice, and so she was sentenced to 21 months in prison. After she was caught, the FBI had to go back and reevaluate 50 murder cases that Sandra and Eagle had been involved in. Luckily though, during this examination, they discovered that in all of these cases, they did not hinge on evidence that Sandra had found, and so there were no convictions that were overturned. As for Jimmy Nelson, he was eventually convicted of Cherita's murder. However, his conviction was overturned. But it had nothing to do with Sandra and Eagle. The evidence used to overturn it was completely separate. And so to this day, we still don't know what happened to Cherita, and her body has still not been found. As for Eagle, nobody was mad at him, and he retired from working crime scenes and got as many treats as he wanted until he passed away peacefully in 2003.
Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have hundreds of videos for you to binge right now. But if you're looking for a recommendation from me of that one video that's worth your time, well, it's this one right here. So give it a watch.